New York City. A hot night. Windows humming with fans. Then a 44 Bulldog cracks the quiet and two lovers drop where they sit. The shooter melts into the dark, and a taunting letter appears. Son of Sam. Streets panic, haircuts change, and a simple parking ticket points to a name. So I'll start with who he was, and where this began. Where this all began is New York City. In the hot, restless summer of 1976, when subway cars wore graffiti like bruises and the nights ran on sirens and disco beats. I'm writing this like I lived beside it. The radios, the newspapers, the whispers at corner delis. Because everyone in this city felt pulled into the same dark story. The name didn't come right away. First it was only the sound of shots and the echo of hurried footsteps. A pattern we didn't know was a pattern yet. The person the city would learn to fear was David Berkowitz, a 23-year-old postal worker living in Yonkers, just north of the 5 boroughs. He wasn't famous then. He was invisible, the kind of neighbor you don't notice because he doesn't ask to borrow sugar or complain about the music. He had an apartment, a car, late shifts, and a quiet face that hid a violent storm. His world looked ordinary from the curb. That's how a city gets surprised. The victims were ordinary too. Young couples talking in parked cars after a movie. Friends walking to their building with grocery bags and summer sweat on their foreheads. People who believed a busy street meant safety. The time period matters. July 1976 to July 1977. 12 months stretched tight as a wire, when heat made tempers short and windows stayed open. When a killer learned the map of the city by way of fear. The boroughs became chapters. The Bronx and Queens, then Brooklyn, then back again, as if a grim hand were flipping pages in the dark. In my notes from those nights, I can still hear the local DJs lowering their voices after a song, telling listeners to lock car doors, to stay in groups, to watch the sidewalks. Mothers told their daughters, change your hair, don't sit in parked cars, don't walk alone. Barbers joked about bangs and curls until the laughter died out. Rumors said the gunman targeted long, dark hair. Some women cut theirs short. Fear turned style into armor. But behind the normal routine, something felt off. Only we didn't see it yet. The streets looked the same, but eyes lingered longer at corners, and every snapping twig was a footstep in disguise. The city's heartbeat didn't change its tempo. Our breathing did. We held it together without meaning to. The first sign was small, but it stayed with me. The first sign was small, but it stayed with me. Two reports that sounded too similar, too close in time, and the same kind of wound. A 44 caliber round tearing quiet into crisis. The newspapers didn't connect them right away. Why would they? New York has noise. New York has crime. But the distances felt like a line drawn with a ruler. And the late hours were always the same song. A conversation. A car door. Then panic. I walked past a bodega on Queens Boulevard one humid evening and saw a stack of tabloids with a headline that didn't yet have a face to go with it. Couple shot in car. And I thought of a different headline from the Bronx a few weeks earlier. I'm no detective. I'm just someone who writes it down. But even from the sidewalk, the pattern pressed against the glass like a handprint. Families tried to keep normal. Dinner at the same time. Fans humming in bedroom windows. TV light on living room walls. The city's lifestyle chugged along. Subway to work. Coffee carts near midtown lobbies. Bar stools sticking to the backs of knees. People don't know they're walking through a chapter until the page turns. We were mid-sentence, and we didn't yet know the name that would stamp itself across a year of our lives. Neighbors swapped small warnings. Don't sit with the engine off too long. Don't lean your seat all the way back in the dark. Couples chose bright blocks to park and talk, and then chose brighter ones when the first block no longer felt bright enough. Everyone learned to measure a shadow. At parties, someone always said, "Let's just keep it moving." At first, everything looked normal, until one detail didn't fit. The letters. When the letters came, taunting and theatrical, it felt like the city's nightmares had learned to read. The writer called himself Son of Sam, and his words crawled off the page into every living room. A new moniker strangled the older one. Caliber Killer. The city didn't just have a gunman, It had a voice in its ear. Investigators would later say some details in those letters didn't match the man who would be caught. But the tone, the need to be seen, those matched the fear perfectly. And yet I can't jump to the ending. This is a diary. We walk together, block by block. That brings me to the hours before everything changed. That brings me to the hours before everything changed. On a Saturday night, the air held the kind of heat that sticks to skin. People stayed out later because the night felt gentler than their apartments. On July 31st, 1977, in Brooklyn, in a neighborhood where streetlights dipped their heads toward parked cars, Stacy Moskowitz and Robert Violante found a place to talk. If you've ever sat in a car to escape a noisy party, you know the peace of it. A bubble of quiet inside the city's endless noise. But months before that final night, this pattern had already formed its edges. In the summer of 1976, shots had rung out in the Bronx and Queens, lovers' lanes, ordinary streets. The timestamps blurred together. 1:10 a.m., 2:05 a.m., 3 a.m. The killer chose late hours because late hours don't argue back. He watched people, waited, stepped close, and fired. Then he vanished into a city that always has an open door somewhere. One routine step didn't happen that day. No one noticed at first that several scenes shared the same kind of ammunition, the same caliber, the same cold rhythm. I remember a neighbor in my building saying she wouldn't take out the trash alone anymore. Another kept her car keys between her fingers like a tiny brass claw. The city is never quiet, but it can feel like it's holding its breath. We were holding ours, and then at some scenes, there were whispers, a figure moving away, a car with its engine ticking, a man who didn't belong there but didn't look so out of place that anyone would shout. That's how strangers pass, by pretending they're not strangers. And then came the moment the quiet broke. Letters. The kind that name themselves. The kind that talk like they own the night. He wrote the police. He wrote the press. The New York Daily News. A columnist who could make a note run like lava down every block. "Hello from the gutters of NYC," the letter started, almost like a bad joke that forgot to end. "Viewers, stay with me, because what happened next will surprise you." And then came the moment the quiet broke. And then came the moment the quiet broke. The city got mail. The letter writer used phrases that sounded like they were dipped in gasoline. Dramatic, disturbing, self-named, Son of Sam. He wanted us to read him by streetlight, to say his name like we were feeding him. He wrote about Papa Sam, about pain and blood, about hunting. At first, everything looked like the ranting of a bragger, until the details lined up too neatly with our fear. The police tried to work the case like a math problem. Ballistics, neighborhoods, times, weather, likely parking spots. Composites were drawn and redrawn. Witnesses argued over memory. He had dark hair. No, lighter. He was taller than me. No, maybe my height. If you pause the clock right here, the next decision changes the case forever. Do you warn the city loudly and risk panic? Or do you keep your cards close and risk letting him move unseen? The city needed both safety and silence. It got noise. People stopped lingering under street trees. Couples chose crowded diners. Some women dyed their hair or wore hats. The city that never sleeps started sleeping with one eye open. The letters arrived like drumbeats. The gun spoke again and again. Detectives tried to stitch clues together. The .44 Bulldog revolver, the way he approached from the driver's side sometimes, and the passenger's side other times. The escape routes mapped by alleys and lawns and gentle slopes. The feeling that he watched first and shot only when the moment felt scripted. We told ourselves the simple things. Keep moving. Keep talking. Don't sit still. The killer told himself a different story. I know that now because the ending tells me so. But in the build-up, all we had were fragile guesses and one loud certainty. Someone was working nights and writing letters. Because the next minute is when it happens. Because the next minute is when it happens. A car door clicks. A streetlight hums. A couple leans closer to hear each other over the night. Then a shape moves near the passenger window. Shots. The sound is sharp enough to slice through music 2 blocks away. The city is a place where noise doesn't always earn a glance. Too many hijacked our attention before. But this noise learned our names. At one scene, the shooter leaves in a hurry, feet pounding dirt, then concrete, then nothing. At another, a neighbor steps to the window too late. The crime scenes share a terrible clarity. Glass like sugar on the seat, blood darkening the upholstery, the smell of gunpowder under the usual city perfume of hot tar and fried onions and distant rain. Police chalk the angles, bag shells, mark tire tracks, and take Polaroids until the flash feels like lightning that forgot the thunder. At first, everything looked normal, until one detail wasn't. The letters again, the taunts, the name that made headlines. It's one thing to fear a faceless pattern. It's another to fear a voice that insists on being heard. The killer wanted to be famous, but he also wanted to be a secret. That's the push-pull of monsters who write, "See me, don't catch me." I leaned closer and saw the first clear clue we could hold in our hands, a caliber that wouldn't shut up. The 44 special rounds pointed their way back to a bulldog revolver, a model not everybody bought, not everybody carried. The gun would be a thread. The thread would be a map. I leaned closer and saw the first clear clue. And the room filled with a new kind of urgency. Detectives widened their circle. Gun shops, permit lists, stolen weapon reports, anyone with a reason to own a bulldog or lie about not owning one. Families were interviewed. Friends were checked. Alibis were tested. The clock on the wall kept time. Fear kept a different time entirely. Then came July 31st, 1977. In Brooklyn's Bath Beach area, Stacy Moskowitz and Robert Violante sitting in a car under a streetlight, the city warm and buzzing behind them. A man approached. Shots cracked the night. Stacy was fatally wounded. Robert survived but lost much of his sight. The city didn't just cry. It screamed. Sirens, a crowd, a taped-off street that felt suddenly too small for so much pain. The clue raised a question no one could answer. How can someone walk up to a car like that and then vanish like a rumor? Then someone said, "Check for parking tickets." It sounded too simple, almost naive, like telling the ocean to sit still. But we checked. We always check. A parking ticket had been written in that area around the time of the shooting, the kind of mundane city punishment that doesn't feel like a clue until it becomes the only one that matters. Then someone said, "We check for parking tickets." We did. Then someone said, "Check for parking tickets." We did. The search pulled up a ticket issued near a fire hydrant in Brooklyn, written around the same night and place. It was tied to a Ford Galaxy registered to a man in Yonkers, a David Berkowitz. If this is the moment where the story shifts, it does so with paperwork, not fireworks. Two facts can't both be true, unless there's a third thing we missed. Either that was a coincidence, or we had a name that finally belonged to a face. Detectives drove to Yonkers, compared notes with the Yonkers police, and learned of odd complaints from neighbors about a man and a barking dog, and letters that dripped with anger, even when read under fluorescent light. His car was observed. Inside, through the glass, sat a duffel bag, a map with circles on neighborhoods already underlined by grief, and the ordinary clutter of a life that didn't look like a headline until it did. The map didn't confess. The bag didn't either. But together, with the ticket, they started whispering. Viewers, stay with me, because what happened next rewrote the timeline. The cops waited. They watched. They wanted to make the stop clean and quiet. Hours crawl when you're trying not to spook the ending. Then the door opened. He came out. They moved in. That's when the room went silent. And we realized what we were standing in. That's when the room went silent. And we realized what we were standing in. The threshold between fear and a name. Officers approached Berkowitz as he reached his car on August 10, 1977. The arrest would be quoted 100 ways, but the line that stuck was this: "You got me." In his car, they found a .44 Bulldog revolver. In his apartment, they would find the kind of things that fill evidence boxes and make detectives exhale in a way that's half relief, half rage. he confessed quickly with a flat voice that made the words sound like they belonged to somebody else. He called himself Son of Sam, and he talked about a neighbor named Sam Carr, about a dog he claimed had commanded him to kill. The story sounded like a fever dream scratched into notebook paper. It didn't matter whether the myth fit perfectly or not. The bullets fit. The letters fit. The ticket fit. The map fit. The duffel fit. Puzzle pieces don't always kiss along every edge, but the picture shows itself. By the time the police arrived, the real work was just starting. To reconstruct the year, to name the victims with care, and not just as entries in a file. To trace the nights backward and forward, to place this man along the curbs where lives tilted and fell. The city took one long breath and let it out slow. People still checked the back seats of their cars, but their hands shook less. The sirens still sang at 2 a.m., but they didn't sound like a chorus of ghosts anymore. By the time the police arrived, the real work was just starting. By the time the police arrived, the real work was just starting. NYPD retraced 12 months of terror and put pins back in the wall map, red lines on routes that made too much sense after the fact. Ballistics connected scenes to the bulldog. Handwriting teased threads between letters. Detectives wrote out timelines until the ink ran thin. In every major case, there are mistakes. In cases that become legends, those mistakes get loud. Some scenes had been contaminated by crowds, some evidence smudged by too many hands, some early theories clung too tightly to the wrong suspects. One procedure wasn't followed, and it would haunt the case, but the capture held. The core evidence matched. Media pressure didn't fade just because the cuffs clicked. If anything, cameras crowded closer. Reporters asked if the city had ignored warnings, if the first letters should have been read differently, if more patrols might have saved a life here or there. The answers were honest and unsatisfying. Investigations are human. Humans miss things. What mattered now was the chain that ran from gun to bullet, to bodies, to letters, to car, to man. A chain thick enough to hold in court. Then the focus shifted to how the letters named themselves and whether anyone else touched the page. Copycats had surfaced. Hoaxes always do when the city is bleeding. But under lab lights and forensic eyes, the patterns hardened. The dog story wouldn't stand a courtroom's daylight. The evidence would. Then the focus shifted to suspects and angles we had to close, one by one. Then the focus shifted to suspects and angles we had to close, one by one. People who'd been side-eyed by neighbors got a clean page again. Alibis were checked. Work schedules lined up against attack windows. Gas receipts and parking stubs were sifted from glove compartments. Forensic techs ran their tests. Detectives ran their legs. Prosecutors began the slow dance with evidence that ends in a courtroom. At first it looked like we had everything, but investigators soon discovered something that didn't make sense. The killer's path sometimes curved in ways that suggested scouting, not accident. He may have watched for days, maybe weeks. That told us about his patience and about the city's blind spots. Another not quite right piece. The letter's performative voice. It swaggered. The man in cuffs was blanker, less theatrical in person. Could both be true? The answer is complicated because people are complicated. The evidence didn't need his personality to match the font. It needed rifling marks to match the bullets. And they did. Still, detectives circled neighbors and friends of friends, made sure the nets didn't knot around the wrong ankles. False certainty ruins justice. We needed the solid parts. The gun, the car, the ticket, the maps, his own words. And that discovery forced a new look at timelines. Could Berkowitz have hit every scene, given the distances and his routes from Yonkers? The answer came back yes, one night at a time, with boring details that solve cases. Traffic patterns, bridge toll times, clocked-in shifts. No single piece sang. Together they made a choir. And that discovery forced a new look at a handful of objects and timestamps. Experts walked the media through the technical parts without drowning us in jargon. They explained ballistics, that tiny scars inside a barrel can scratch unique signatures onto bullets. They explained lineups, that memory argues with itself, and that's why you corroborate. They explained letters, that words have styles that can be measured like footprints in snow. Meanwhile, the public kept talking. Theories multiplied. Some people swore they'd seen two men at a scene. Others insisted on the loner portrait. Leaks and rumors hurtled over facts. The official line held, the evidence points to Berkowitz. The timeline holds steady. The gun does not lie. The city wanted the math to be finished. The sum written in thick pencil across the top of the board. Solved. But even solved cases have splinters. They stick around and remind you of the nights when you didn't know. The case now had two paths, and only one could be right. The path of noise and the path of proof. The second one wins in a courtroom. Then, just when it cooled down, a new test came back. Not the kind that undid everything. This isn't that story, but the kind that polished the chain we already had. Ballistic confirmations tightened the screws. The map in the car wasn't just creepy, it matched. The letters weren't just theater, they were anchors. Then, just when it cooled down, a new test came back. Then, just when it cooled down, a new test came back, and it didn't undo the case. It underlined it. The .44 Bulldog traced consistently. The ticket remained the no-glamour hero, and interviews filled in the last thin spaces with unremarkable details that, together, felt remarkable. The twist wasn't a reversal. It was a realization. The city had been chasing a loud myth and a quiet man at the same time. The letters gave us drama. The evidence gave us certainty. It answered one question and created three more. Why the letters? Why the theater? Why those victims? Berkowitz's explanations wandered. Voices, commands, Sam, the dog. The courtroom would not live on that. It would live on the chain. Gun to bullet, bullet to bodies, bodies to nights, nights to car, car to ticket, ticket to a name. Detectives followed the new trail not to a new suspect, but to a clearer picture of the old one. Storytellers love a sudden turn. Justice loves a careful road. So we followed the new trail to the place where the story ends. A courtroom. So we followed the new trail to the place where the story ends. A courtroom. In 1978, David Berkowitz pleaded guilty to multiple counts of murder. There was no sprawling trial, no season-long television arc. The sentences were life terms, stacked like cinder blocks, heavy enough that the calendar itself would buckle under them. Everyone thought this was the end. Maybe it was the middle, because memory doesn't stop just because a judge speaks. Families still set extra chairs that no one sits in. Friends still trace names on paper to feel the shape of them again. A city still hears a late-night pop and flinches before remembering, it's over. But the diary won't end on a headline. It ends on breath leaving the lungs more easily. It ends on windows opening again. It ends on the corner bodega playing the radio without dropping the volume when the news comes on. It ends on a city that learned to look at letters and see through them. Which brings me to where the case stands tonight. Status: solved. David Berkowitz, the son of Sam, was arrested on August 10, 1977, confessed, and later pleaded guilty in 1978, receiving multiple life sentences. The chain that mattered held tight. A .44 Bulldog revolver, ballistics, letters, a parking ticket, a car, a name. A quiet street still waits for an answer only when a case is unsolved. Here the answer sits behind walls and iron. There are still debates around edges, questions about letters' tone, about what fear does to a city's memory. But the core doesn't wobble. The solved part is the part that lets the city sleep. The solved part lets us breathe. But stories like this ask us to stay awake, too. Was it the gun, the ticket, or the map that really closed the door? Was it a neighbor's call, or a detective who refused to file a hunch under coincidence? Was it the ordinary parking ticket that became extraordinary because someone looked twice? What detail stood out to you? The letters, the .44, or the way a city learned to keep moving even when it was afraid? Comment your theory, share your moment, and tell me if you want a part 2 when we revisit what fear taught New York and how small clues, seen at the right time, can change everything. I'll keep the page open until the truth walks in.